Thank you, Bob. And on behalf of both Dave and myself, thank you also for spending this afternoon with us. Before I begin, let me talk to you about the cab ride I had last night, middle of the night from the airport to the hotel. And bear with me, it makes sense. So I get into the cab. I had a miserable flight coming in from Boston. I was not really in a mood to talk, but there's this man. He's probably in his late 60s, right? From Jamaica. Thick accent, two accented guys sitting in the cab. So he asked me, what convention I'm in town to attend, and I said records management, and he said, what does this mean? So I talked to him about, files and paper and email, and it's all about how you store it, how you destroy it, how you, use it. And he says, oh yeah, I know all about that. And you know why? Because my first job out of school, and this is a man in his 60s, was as a filing clerk in the Ministry of Health in Jamaica. So he says all he did day in and day out was to go look for specific files to take it from one place to another, right? And how it was very tough to always figure out where that file is. So they had the system where they looked at the last correspondence in the file to figure out whose desk it is on, a lot of complex stuff. And he said when the file was, so I asked what happens when the file goes inactive, when there's no more correspondence. And he said, that's when it gets really tough. And he says, let me tell you, kid, and anytime somebody calls me a kid now, I love the guy. So he says, let me tell you, it gets the hardest when the legal department gets involved. Right. And so that's the true story. I'm not kidding. So that's a segue to what we're here to talk about. E-discovery is where your world runs smack dab into the legal world, right? And it's really important for us to talk about it because, well, apparently that's what you want to hear. And we are in the service business. But also because everything that you do in records management, how you treat the record, be it paper or digital, like Bob said, from the point it's created to how you manage its life cycle, it has a huge bearing on what happens downstream in the e-discovery part, where the lawyers get involved. And we'll talk about why that is so, why it is the big tail that's wagging the dog, and what we can do in the records management, retention, destruction, policy arena to prepare ourselves better, right, for e-discovery, to help our companies reduce their costs, reduce the risks, because there are plenty of risks. That's why the lawyers come into the play, right? So that's what we're going to talk about. And that's broadly the agenda, right? I'll briefly discuss what are the trends in e-discovery, what's happening, what's driving all the pressure we face, from e-discovery, and where it's probably headed, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that just to set the stage, the context, and I will then hand it off to Dave Berg, who, as you heard Bob say, runs the Forensic Technology Services Group, the practice, at arguably the premier consulting and advisory organization in the world, PricewaterhouseCoopers. He also has the added benefit of being a great partner for Iron Mountain Stratify. And he will talk to you from his perspective, what he and his team sees day in and day out at customer locations, talking to you, working with you. And he'll also talk about how Pricewaterhouse and Stratify partner together in helping you fulfill that mission. And then we'll come back and talk about really the main theme of this conversation, which is given how much records management influences the success or the failure of an e-discovery event, how it's very important, very critical to be proactive as opposed to what we have been thus far, mostly reactive, in handling these issues from a cost perspective, from a risk perspective. So that's the main theme of the conversation. I hope you find it useful. I know you all just finished eating, so I hope I don't put you to sleep. All right, so I'm not going to follow the slides much, but they're there just for you to sort of get the context. And this is really about what is the definition of electronic discovery. It's about what you do to the documents in the event of a litigation or in the event of a regulatory event, a regulatory demand, right? You go collect the documents from the myriad locations that you have placed them in. This could be paper, electronic, office documents, email documents, and you hand them off to the attorneys, your in-house attorneys as well as the outside counsel, who, by the way, cost a lot of money. Unlike you and me, they charge by the hour, right? So you hand it off to them, and they have a very important job to do. They have a job to figure out which of those documents need to be produced to the other side or to the government, and which should be held back. And if you don't do this right, if you give too much, well, then you could land in more trouble than you're already in, because the other side knows something more than they ought to. And if you give too little, the courts take a dim view of that. They get mad. They're saying you're not being cooperative, right? So it's walking that fine line between producing too much and producing too little, and it is fraught with risk. There's a famous case that everybody talks about, Morgan Stanley v. Coleman, where because the court deemed, it actually happened here in Florida, in a district court in Florida, because the judge deemed that Morgan Stanley was not playing ball, Morgan Stanley was levied a $1.5 billion, that's with a B. I know it's not much money nowadays, but $1.5 billion fine. It got overturned later, but that's how much is at stake if you don't do it right. Right? So that's e-discovery. That is collecting these documents, handing them off to the attorneys, and for them to deal with the risk factors involved. Why is this so expensive? There are a couple of slides about that. One, when you move from the physical documents to the electronic documents, folks got very prolific. There's a story that every year the world produces more information than has been cumulatively produced since the dawn of civilization. Think about that. Every year we generate more stuff than we had done since the dawn of civilization. Now, most of it is Facebook and Twitter and crap, but the volumes are staggering, right? And that's just one example of a litigation that Stratify and Mountain is dealing with. That is about 70 million pages in the main database that the lawyers are looking at. This is after we have done all the filtering and everything, right? The second example is one with 50 million pages, right? And why is this so important? That's the math behind that number, right? A typical lawyer can review, depending on the system you're using,